Hi, welcome to the Newbery Chronicles, a podcast where two people read through every single book to win a Newbery medal and then talk about each one. I'm Michael.
And this is Rebecca.
And this time, we are talking about the 1967 medal winner, Up a Road Slowly, by Irene Hunt. But first, a few corrections, because we on the Newbery Chronicles aspire to journalistic integrity.
Well, before we get to the corrections,
Oh my gosh.
let us give a disclaimer that we
true.
both are recovering from COVID, and so we might sound a little bit more congested. You might hear a few
Or husky
coughs.
and those sexy, respiratory disease voices.
We have not picked up cigarette smoking. We are just a tad bit sick.
Just a tad. Also, I think there's someone driving by with loud music on their car, if you just heard that.
Enjoy.
So, on to the corrections, where we eat crow.
Where Michael eats crow.
Michael eats crow, because both of these are things that Michael said. So, first correction is fairly minor, but I just have to point it out since I noticed it when I was reviewing the audio from last episode. Last time, I said, welcome to the Newbery Files instead of the Newbery Chronicles, and I just want to confirm that you did not accidentally stumble into a parallel universe in which we had decided on our second place name for this podcast. It was just me being a dummy. Secondly, maybe more significantly, last time we said Elizabeth George Spear was one of two authors to have ever won 2 Newbery medals, and this is in fact incorrect. There have been 6. There have been 6 authors who have won multiple Newbery medals. Kate DeCamillo, E.L. Konigsberg, Joseph Krumgold, Lois Lowry, Catherine Patterson, and then, of course, Elizabeth George Spear. So, in the spirit of journalism, I must say, we regret the error.
Mistakes were made.
Mistakes were made by me. Anyway, this time, we're starting a fresh new slate with no mistakes, and we're doing so by talking about Up a Road Slowly, a book that Rebecca thinks doesn't make very many mistakes either. So Rebecca's a big fan of this one. I like it too, but we'll get into that later. So first, I want to start off with the author bio. It's my turn to do the author bio, and so we've got Irene Hunt here. A woman with a very mysterious past, we found out, because it was very difficult to find out what year that she was born, because her Wikipedia article gives 2 different dates, 1903 and 1907.
And then the facts for when she would have written certain books or when she would have died differs on which birth date they decided to use in that sentence.
As an English teacher, I feel like I should be compelled to remind myself that Wikipedia is not the best source to use uncritically. And this is a good example of that, because the editors, the Wikipedians, I think they have a cute name for themselves.
The Wiccans.
The Wiccans, the Wikipedians, they didn't check their math or correlate their math with each other. But it's either 1907 or 1903 that she was born, and we think it's 1907. We've double-checked other sources, and some of these sources, as tends to happen in the internet, all link back to Wikipedia, in which her birth date is uncited. And so if I were a really, good citizen of the internet, I would edit Wikipedia to have one of those citations needed things by her name.
Yes, but we do think we found her obituary or something close to it, which would have her birth date being in 1907. All of that is fairly insignificant, but what is not insignificant is that she actually died on her birthday, and we believe it was her 94th birthday.
In the grand Shakespearean tradition, right?
Right.
Shakespeare.
Right.
All right, well, anyway.
Mark Twain, right?
Maybe.
He came in with a comet, went out with a comet.
Yeah, but comets can come on different dates.
Well, still, it's cool.
Yes. She has a great legacy. There's not a ton about her life that I think is interesting to share, although I'm sure that her life was interesting to her as she experienced it. But so she was born in Illinois in probably 1907. Her dad died when she was young, and so her grandfather was kind of the one who was the father figure to her. She eventually left Illinois to go to college in Minneapolis, and then returned to Illinois, where she was a public school teacher for the majority of her career. And she taught English and she taught French. And she had a short stint at the University of South Dakota teaching psychology. but then she returned back to doing secondary ed and eventually died in Illinois in 2001. Interestingly, most of her writing was done very late in life. She didn't start writing full time until after she retired from teaching. And although she had written several books by then at that point, her career really took off. So as a writer, so this is really her second career after being a school teacher for so long. And I think as we get into the book itself, that'll come up a bit more because there's some autobiographical elements in this novel. But
didn't she also win like a Hans Christian Andersen Legacy Award or something?
She did, yeah. I didn't want to make the other awards jealous or the Newbery Award jealous by
right.
mentioning other awards, But yeah, don't tell it to John Newbery, but Hans Christian Andersen got in on the awards game.
What I think is so neat about her is she didn't start writing until she was in like her 50s and 60s, but she had several like well-acclaimed novels. Across 5 Aprils was really popular before this one ever came out. And that was actually her favorite book. So she wrote, like, I discovered her in middle school, and we'll get into this book in a second, but and kind of just devoured all the books that I could read by her. She wrote Across 5 Aprils, which is set in the Civil War, I believe, and then No Promises in the Wind, which is, I want to say, this sweeping tale about this kid that's been abused and is coming out of that. She wrote this, and then, what was the other one?
The Lottery Rose.
The Lottery Rose. That's the one I think that's about
I know
abuse.
this because the books are on our shelves, and I alphabetized them.
Yeah, see, I have not read the other ones. I've only read them once, but I've read Up Road Slowly several times. But anyway, I think this author is just incredible. And it's crazy to me that there's not a lot about her online because, I don't know.
She is like a fairly acclaimed author. Like,
right.
She won a Newbery Honor, which is like a runner-up to this for Across 5 Aprils.
Mm-hmm.
And you would think that winning a Newbery Medal and a Newbery Honor Award would give you more of an internet footprint, especially because she died in the 21st century. It wasn't like she died like, way back where, you'd have to go back into print media archives to find stuff about her. Like, presumably, some of her work has appeared online at some point.
Yeah, I don't know. We should all be talking about her if we knew more about her because it's just incredible. But let me talk about this book.
Yeah. Tell us, what is Up Road Slowly about? Because the title doesn't tell us anything.
Hey, you're going to get your moment in the sun to talk about the title and the cover. But
got an axe to grind on the title.
This book is a coming-of-age story about Julie Trelling. She and her brother Chris come to live with her Aunt Cordelia in their early childhood after their mother dies suddenly. She has an older sister, Laura, who stays living with her father. So she's separated from her, but she adores her. She's very close with her. Aunt Cordelia's house is only 5 miles away, but her father lives in town and Aunt Cordelia lives in the country. And so it's significant. They don't see each other super often, and she has a whole new set of friends. She goes to a one-room schoolhouse where her Aunt Cordelia teaches. I think it's hard to summarize coming-of-age stories, but just some things that I think are highlighted throughout the book are really her relationships with this family. It's not a new family, but it's her new nuclear family. Her Aunt Cordelia, her Uncle Haskell,
who is not married to Aunt Cordelia, but instead Aunt Cordelia's brother.
That's her brother. And Aunt Cordelia was her mother's sister. I don't think that I specified what that aunt was. So Uncle Haskell is her overindulged alcoholic uncle who's always really close to publishing his novel, but everyone knows he's not really writing anything. He's not really committed to any endeavors. This book follows Julie through her childhood as she navigates her relationships with peers in school. Some big characters that you see that are pretty pivotal in Julie's growing up, but also the development of her character is Aggie Kilpin, I think is her last name, who is a lower functioning, poorer student in the school that Aunt Cordelia is constantly pushing Julie to be kind to, including her in their activities. Aggie dies in the book from just really, she gets sick and her family does not know how to care for her, is not properly caring for her, is kind of shut off from the rest of the town and doesn't really want to accept their advice. And that is a very, you see, I think that is a big part in the book where Julie's character matures as she sees this very ugly, terrible thing. Obviously, Julie's gone through trauma herself and losing her mother, but that scene itself, I really think takes a turn in the novel where you start to see Julie grow up, and that is pretty pivotal in the rest of her in the book. Also, her relationship with Carlotta, who is a definitely from a wealthier family in town.
She's got a horse, right?
She's got a pony and a pony cart.
Yeah.
And so that relationship is very formative in Julie's maturity as well, and just kind of navigating like what her values are. And you see that. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Danny Trevor is another one of her good friends who ends up being her love interest. So you see her growing up with him. This book takes us into high school with Julie, where she had originally planned to move back in with her dad because he got remarried, so there would be a woman in the house that could help care for her in her high school years, and she decides to stay with Aunt Cordelia. You see her relationship with her uncle really take off when she develops an interest in writing and he becomes a coach for her. What we don't know at the time when he starts doing that is Uncle Haskell is actually dying. And so that's kind of his parting gift to Julie, but it's also Julie's parting gift to him for them to build that relationship. There's another big subplot between, you see Aunt Cordelia really develop through this book too, through the eyes of Julie. And there is a man that Aunt Cordelia in the past was very interested in, is now married, and that's Jonathan Eltwing, and he comes back to town. They redevelop a friendship, and that plays a lot in a lot of scenes in this book. The book ends with her getting a story published in a magazine right as she's graduating high school and beginning to go to college, and that's kind of where we leave Julie. So some things that are unique about this book is the setting is never defined.
Much like the author's birth date,
Exactly.
It is a subject of much ambiguity.
Maybe all of this is very intentional because it doesn't really matter.
I love the idea that Irene Hunt is like got a lifelong conspiracy to keep whether she was born in 1907 or 1903 out of the public eye.
So anyway, some people think that this book takes place in the 40s after the war. And is set in the Midwest. I mean, Irene Hunt herself was from Illinois, so that could very well be. And then they talk about some of the kids are going to college, and they say that they're going to college in the East, and so that would make sense if it was set in the Midwest. Others think it's set in the 60s when the book was published. Michael and I don't really think it seems...
It doesn't make any sort of sense to me.
Like it would be.
Like, I don't know. As I was reading it, I thought initially that it was set early in the 20th century, and then they started talking about how people had cars, and then I was like, oh, so it's not like 1910 like I was thinking, but it definitely does not, unless Irene Hunt was very out of touch with what was going on in the 1960s, it does not feel like it is set in the 1960s. There are no cultural signifiers, like either positive or negative about the 1960s. It feels very like early mid-century to me.
Yeah. So I feel like I summarized that kind of disjointedly, but I think it's hard in a coming of age book.
Yeah, it's like fairly episodic.
But it is fairly episodic, but it all flows really well. And, I have a lot to say about what I liked, so I'm just going to stop talking now and let you talk about what you liked, and then we'll get to me.
Okay. So I had never read this before. Rebecca had read this many times. So I ended up liking quite a bit about this. It's the kind of book that I used to read a lot of, and I really enjoy this kind of book. Like, it is very similar in some ways to Anne of Green Gables, which is a book that I really like, where you have a child who has some sort of traumatic or difficult past coming and living with people who aren't used to having kids around, and they're kind of like eccentric and or strict, and they have to like learn how to get along with one another, and they become kind of like a really warm community of people where the child is allowed to like flourish and grow up and like become like a sophisticated, well functioning adult. And uh, I think that there are ways that that kind of story can be kind of, you know, whatever, anodyne, but like this is a really good version of that. I also like and Green Gables, like I said, which is another really good version of that. And so like you have a lot of these beats that are very familiar to me, but I think that they're just like like very warm and enjoyable, right? Like Aunt Cordelia is the school teacher, and she's like this extremely principled school teacher, and like honestly sounds like the kind of person I would not get along with at all. Like she refuses to call Julie Julie; she calls her Julia because she thinks that that sounds more Latinate than Julie. And as like someone who teaches, I think she teaches French, right? Just like Irene Hunt did. I mean, she doesn't exclusively teach that since she's the one room schoolhouse teacher, but I think that she has like a background in that, but background in the romances. Um, she's like very classically minded, and that leads her to be very rigid at the beginning, and it's like a source of great tension between Julie and her. Um, and eventually, they learn how to make that work with one another. And the way in which Julie makes it work is she kind of rises academically to the occasion of her of her aunt, like, and becomes like this really like academically industrious student, and like is super lame. But like I always liked stories in which there were like kids who were like really motivated in school, because I don't know. You don't get a lot of. I don't know. As weird as it is to say, you don't get a ton of stories that are like that while also having interesting protagonists. Like a lot of times, it's either like really boring, like I'm just like the Hardy Boys, and I'm like industrious, and I'm good at everything. And the Hardy Boys are very boring characters. But someone like this, someone like Julie, is actually like an interesting character. You see her growth, and there's a lot of dimensions there. And she's also like motivated by school, and like I was also very motivated by school growing up, and so I don't know, it's fun to read about that. And also her aunt learns how to be kind of more emotionally available to her, and she never really changes to be like a less um, principled person, but she finds ways to connect with Julie, and they have like some good moments with each other, and I think that that's sweet and well earned, like the relationship that grows, like the rapport that they grow together. I also really like Uncle Haskell as well. Like he's a very fun character. I mean, it's kind of sad, he's like a failed writer more or less, who is just like using writing now as an excuse to just go like get blasted during the day. Um, and like that in and of itself is kind of sad, and there's a lot of stuff in his backstory that they kind of use to explain that. But I also think that like he's very funny. Like he's often this
So
kind of
funny.
like chaotic like character who comes in and will like say or do things to provoke people, or just say something kind of sarcastic and then leave and go drink again or something like that. And he is kind of like this wisecracking, like mischievous character who has all these like emotional depths that Julie again like finds a way to like eventually have a warm rapport with and care about him and all that sort of stuff, and it's nice.
And what's also great is throughout the thread of the book, you see Julie like having this sincere affection for her uncle, but also this fear that she's going to become him. Like anything that she does that is, boastful or attention seeking, she's like, oh, is that Uncle Haskell? Like, I don't know. And anyway, I'm interrupting you, but
It's good. No,
it is so good.
I agree with that, and I think Rebecca's gonna have more articulate things to say than I, because I'm just reading this for the first time. But I think that like I mentioned at the beginning, like this is a sort of story that I've seen a lot, but it's a good version of that because within those like expected beats, there is like the characters feel very human and fleshed out for the most part. Like we'll get to negatives. I've got a few things to say, not like a lot of negatives, but I'll wait until that point. I also will say too, the prose is very very nice in this, and I think I can't remember the other book that I said that had nice prose. I've commented on this before, but
Was it Witch of Blackbird Pond?
maybe, but like Witch of Blackwood Pond is kind of a modern-y like children's book in the sense of like you kind of understand like what the voice is going to be, but this the prose here is a lot more like florid and decorative than
Yeah.
like I'm used to seeing in children's literature, and I think it probably like skews for an older audience like as a result. But I don't know, it's just really well put together prose, and um, I don't want to say like it's always an afterthought when someone writes a children's book like how like beautiful the prose is, but it sometimes feels like an afterthought. Maybe in something like The Witch of Blackwood Pond, which is like very readable and straightforward, and that's like a skill in and of itself. But this is a story where, like Rebecca and I mentioned earlier, it's pretty episodic in the sense of like one chapter will be like an incident in her life, but the prose really ties it together and makes these kind of psychological connections between these different incidents that I thought it was just really lovely to read.
Yeah.
So yeah, those were the things that I liked about it. What did you like about it, Rebecca?
Well, I like that you got all those things right, first off. So, good job. No, I was really worried when we were reading this book together because this is a book that I want to say, if I'm remembering correctly, I discovered this book in middle school, just in my school library. There was probably a display about like Newbery winners or something. I don't know. But I loved this book. And so then I read all of Irene Hunt's books. And this is one of those, I don't know if you all have books that you just like revisit when you want to feel good, or, you just want to read something that's comfortable and safe and you already know you're going to like it. This is one of those books for me, like my Friday night, curl up on the couch, reread this book. I love it. And so I was worried when we were reading it together that you would think it was lame or something. Because also Michael has made fun of me for a long time, which I'm just going to say Michael has made fun of me for a long time for the title of this book. Because he says it sounds so boring. It's a book that I would have never picked up.
Since you brought it up, now is the time. Now
Okay.
is the time.
And then I'll get back to what I liked. But this is what I'm just saying. This is why I was worried that we were going to read it together. But I'm glad that you.
Yes, they say don't judge a book by its cover. And dear podcast listeners, this is a prime example of that. Not just to judge a book, not judge a book by its cover, but not to judge a book by its title, which is frankly terrible. Right? Up a Road Slowly. 1, tells you nothing about the book, and 2, sounds boring. It would be like paint dries on a wall, right? Or grass grows in a lawn, right?
Wait, say the other book that I love.
Another book that I, again, didn't read for the longest time because the title made it sound awful and boring was A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by, is it Betty Smith?
Betty Smith.
Betty Smith, and that's a very good book too when I eventually read it. But authors out there, because I know that the dozen people who listen to this podcast, one of you's got to be an author, right? Don't title your books things that sound like you can just walk out in your yard and watch.
Well, all I want to say is the titles of those, neither of those titles stopped me from reading them and enjoying them before you. So maybe the lesson is really for you and not for the authors.
It's true. Everyone has their own built-in biases.
Yes.
However, I stand by my assertion that this is not an interesting title.
Back to me. So,
strike number 1 against Up a Road Slowly.
What I love about this book, first and foremost, it is so rich with its characters, which Michael talked a lot about. But this book is really not about very much, but it is about there's so much within that. So Julie and Cordelia's relationship is the one that's at the most highlighted, and I think is so good. There is a scene in the beginning of this book that I think about so much. I think it's so poignant and beautiful, and it just makes me cry. There's Julie has just lost her mom. I can't remember how old she was when she died.
She seems like not that old. Like I want to say like 8 or 9 or something like that.
She's definitely school age, but she's very young. And you can tell that she's too old to be having tantrums, but she's had, obviously, this traumatic loss. And Cordelia is not there. She's probably taking care of something with her sister's passing. We don't know. But she's in the home with the housekeeper, and Julie finds out that she's not going to be going home with her dad. She finds out that she's going to be moving into this big house of Aunt Cordelia's and away from her family, and she just has this huge tantrum. Nobody can calm her down. She ends up, her older sister ends up calming her down, but then later in the day, she just retreats into the cupboard under the stairs, and she won't come out. Miss Peters can't get her out, and eventually Aunt Cordelia comes home, and Julie is just waiting for the scolding. She's just waiting to be yelled at, and instead Aunt Cordelia climbs in under the stairs with her and just holds her, and they cry together. And that scene is so good, and she just hits it out of the park. That's kind of where you start, and that kind of sets the tone for the entire relationship between Julie and Aunt Cordelia. Like, there's this tension there. There's on both sides, but they just grow together throughout this book. And you see Aunt Cordelia seeing a lot of herself in Julie. And what I also love about this book is it's completely told through Julie's perspective. And so I think that the narrative voice is so great in this book. And what I like about it is you can tell that Julie is writing all of this when she's older. You know, she's not writing this as it happens. So you see she has this very reflexive tone. She's even correcting herself and chastising herself at parts, but you can always tell exactly what she's feeling and what her motivations are in that moment and what's driving her to do these things. So I think the narrative voice is just so strong throughout. And while it does have that, reflexive tone, you also see Julie growing as she's telling her story, which I think is really great. Some other relationships.
The Rona's kicking in.
It is because I'm talking a lot. Some other relationships that I think are just so great are, we've mentioned this, but Uncle Haskell's and Cordelia's relationship with their mom is talked about throughout the book, and you feel like you know this mom without ever having met her. Well, you might disagree, but basically, their mother, Cordelia's and Haskell's mom, really loved Haskell, spoiled him, turned his father against him, and couldn't care a bit in the world.
So I'm going to fill in while Rebecca is dying of COVID here. I will let her finish what she was saying, but while we're waiting on that, I will just jump in to say I really like that scene at the beginning of the story too. And don't tell Rebecca this because she's not going to know until she comes back and hears what I didn't like. But I thought that was the best scene in the book. And so the book had nowhere to go but down after that. So when Rebecca comes back, she'll finish what she likes, and that'll be the first thing I say about that I don't like about this book. So it's just a secret between me and you, the listener. Hi, this is Michael in the editing room afterwards. Just wanted to throw a quick note here that Rebecca ended up coughing for quite some time after this, and I was trying to continue the podcast for a while, and then it just didn't end up working. So we're just going to cut to about an hour later after Rebecca had some tea and had a chance to rest her voice that we were able to continue the podcast. So sorry for the technical glitch. I blame COVID-19. Okay, we're back now. An hour later, in which Rebecca has taken some vocal rest and drunk honey tea, like Adele when she had the vocal nodes.
Yes.
But hopefully we're out of the woods. So, Rebecca, you were talking about what you liked about this book.
I'm sorry. I got so excited and I forgot to drink water and just lost it. So I think I was talking about Haskell's and Cordelia's relationship with their mom and their dad. So basically, Haskell is beloved by the mom. The dad is so sad that the mom ruined his son, loves his daughters, and Cordelia ends up being responsible for managing everything on the farm. And so Haskell also, we never hear this directly from him. You don't hear a lot directly from him, but Cordelia believes that Haskell resents his mom for not pushing him and kind of turning his father against him. So that whole dynamic is just fascinating to me, and the way that Irene Hunt kind of weaves the story without even fully introducing you to people, I think is done really, really well. Another relationship that I think is really interesting is the one with Jonathan and Katie Eltwig, and I think that Eltwig, I think, so just to give a little bit of backstory on this, Jonathan, Cordelia's former lover, that's a big term, her former love interest, I should say.
Her beau.
Yes, her former beau, that's a very quaint term from a book like this. Has returned to town with a wife that is described as very frail, and sometimes the extreme word that's used is deranged, other times just fragile of the mind.
Fragile of the mind.
That's kind of how they talk about her.
She's a weird character, to be honest.
And I'm going to get to that in a little bit, but I do think one thing this book does, I don't know if it's intentional, but I really do think there is a distinction between how Aggie is cared for in her state and how Katie is cared for in her state. And I think that Irene Hunt is showing us what kindness and care can do for people that are handicapped in some way. And I think that is a very beautiful arc that's not right there in your face, but if you read it enough times like I have, then I think it is a very beautiful contrast there. I also really love the relationship between Julie and her older sister Laura. We don't get to see that a lot, but when we do see it, I think it's done really well, and she uses that relationship to show what it is like as a kid, and others are growing up before you are, and you see their interests change and their priorities change, and that is very hurtful to you until you understand what it's like. And I think she captures that really well. No one is wrong in where their priorities are, but all of their feelings about it are very valid. And so I love that. Even though we don't see Laura a lot, I think when we do, it's just done really well. I think this character is just, this book is just full of characters that are vibrant and dynamic, and I think that's its strongest characteristic. I also agree with Michael. I think the prose is magnificent. I think the dialogue is really strong. You can hear these characters talking, which Haskell in particular is just so quick with his wit, and even Cordelia and the way that she says things when she's angry, you can hear your aunt that is, or not just an aunt, but that character in your life that you think is so uptight about things, you can hear them talking, but also understand why they care so much about those things that you think are ridiculous. I think the prose and the dialogue is really great. There's one more, I talked about the narrative voice. One thing that I didn't mention is I think it is so amazing that Irene Hunt was so, she was an older lady writing this, and she really can tap into what it feels like in the heart of a child and what things look like from your point of view, and also from the points of view of the caretakers who are caring for these children. And she reminds me a lot of Beverly Cleary in that way.
Future Newbery Medal winner.
Yes. In her Ramona books. And I just, they're just geniuses. So I love that from both of them. One more scene I want to talk about before I give it back to you. Oh, two more things. I'm sorry. I think Without the setting being defined in this book, I think the sense of place is really, really strong. And I don't know how she did that so well, but I just think it's very distinct and very strong. Um, One other scene that I think about often, just if I come across a situation where I want to be judgmental, but I can also kind of empathize with what's going on, is there's this scene where Danny and Julie are together, and um, something tragic does happen with Carlotta that I mentioned earlier. It's never explicitly said, but you can tell that she becomes pregnant um, with Julie's ex, actually, like her first heartbreak. This guy was bad news. Everybody.
Yeah, this dude's like a total dirtbag.
Everybody
Like, I don't really
hated him.
understand
And
why he likes him.
he's the only character in the book that you don't sympathize with at all, I think. I think every other character that Hunt writes in this book, you can sympathize with them on some front, but him is like, he's just...
Well, he almost like sexually assaults her, right?
Yes,
There's like a scene in which
absolutely.
Pascal shows up, right? And
Yes.
saves her from being
Yes.
assaulted by this awful boyfriend of hers.
There is one character that there's just no redeemable qualities that you find with him in the book, and he ends up getting Carlotta pregnant. And so it's kind of the secret in town, and nobody's really talking about it. And Danny and Julie are together one night, and they drive by her parents' house, and they see in the garage there's her little pony cart that's there and turned over on its side. And I just that scene is so good. And Julie tells herself, be very kind, Julie Trelling, be very kind in what you think and say about Carlotta. And I think that line is just so wonderful. And I think we've all had those moments in our lives where we have to stop and think about what we could do and what we could think about that person, what we could say in that conversation. But I think when that kindness is chosen, it's a graciousness that we extend both to ourselves and other people. And that's just a line that I've thought about a lot, and I think it's just really good. So I apologize for my coughing fit. I think that I'm done.
You drink more of this honey tea?
I will. I think that I'm done for the moment. I'm going to turn it over for you to dismantle everything I just said. So
I'm not going to dismantle everything that you said. But it's now time for the section where we talk about what we dislike about this book. And I've already talked about I don't like the title. So take that up with her publisher.
You didn't talk about the cover, though.
Oh, yeah, the cover.
Which there's a few.
I'll get to my first real grievance with the book in a second. And when I say grievance, these are fairly minor things. I like this book overall. But the cover... So the original, first edition cover of this book is like a watercolor of a house in the country. Which is not the best cover for a book that's already called Up a Road Slowly, but it's better than this one, in which it is I don't know what this is. Is this a painting? It's a painting of a house in the country, and there's the road that I guess you go up slowly, and then Julie, or who I presume is Julie, is there in a cardigan and a button-up, kind of hanging on the fence, looking down the road, not up the road, actually. If we're assuming that up the road means up the hill. And she's just, looking out into the horizon, with this, pensive, kind of wholesome look on her face. And for a book that's already called this, it's not good. Rebecca found one that's kind of here's how Rebecca described it. She said, this is a cover in which Julie is, she has boobs on the cover. And I was like, what? And it is a book... Or is a cover that looks very much like it was someone in the 60s or 70s.
She's in a top that's a bit more suggestive. It's not sexy, but she's clearly a teenager. And
she's got boobs is what Rebecca wants you to know. But that one at least makes her look like that she's where everyone else was dropping acid out in San Francisco. She's whatever the teens who stayed in Illinois looked like in the 60s. Anyway, so real things that I think I didn't like about the book, besides the editorial choices on the covers. I do think that the book begins on its strongest note. I think that the book is very compelling when it's, as I said earlier, doing the really dark childhood trauma element of it, and how she's having a hard time adjusting to her life around her, and other dark stuff too, how she's really mean and insensitive to Aggie, who then just dies.
Yes.
Like, there's no reconciliation. She tries to go reconcile herself to Aggie's family, and the family just, like, yells at her, and she has to leave. And I think that's all, like, very, bracing and, like, really well evoked. And I don't want a book to be depressing all the time, but there's a certain point at this book in which she kind of gets over this hump that's maybe, like, halfway through the book. And the rest of the book, I'm not saying that she doesn't grow, but she ceases to face like internal struggles as to the acute degree that the original part of the book does. And a lot of it has to do more with how do I help the people around me who are having struggles. And that's not bad. Like, I like this book overall, but it becomes a little less interesting as it goes along because she becomes self-actualized fairly quickly in terms of the full scope of the book. So I thought, like, it's one of those books where at the beginning, I liked it a little better than at the end. But again, like, it's fairly minor because I still liked the book overall. I thought it was really good. The other thing I'm going to point to is that, like, when she ends up with Danny, I don't think Danny is a very well realized character.
I agree.
And because I don't mean that he's not a well realized character in general, but as a love interest, he is not well realized because most of the book, until they're like horny teenagers, he just is making fun of her. And that's literally his only role. Is every once in a while she'll be doing something and be like, oh, then there's Danny giving me a hard time about whatever. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, Danny. And like I realize that this is kind of how like puberty works. You know, all of a sudden like you start seeing other people differently because you're starting to be like interested in them. However, like by the end of the book, they're talking about like long-term stuff like, oh, do we go to college together, or like when are we going to get married and stuff. And like I just never feel like the book does the groundwork for that. I don't really know who Danny is in relation to her except as like a pest when he's younger, and then all of a sudden as this kind of like honestly like kind of Hardy Boyish like love interest. And if my parents are listening, this is not to besmirch the Hardy Boys. They know I read a lot of the Hardy Boys, but the Hardy Boys themselves are not the interesting parts of those books. And similarly, I don't feel like Danny is very interesting, and it becomes weird how central he becomes. Like by the end of the book, her biggest question is, what am I going to do with my relationship with Danny when he goes off to college, and then I have to make a choice about like whether to do some sort of long distance thing, or is he going to meet someone cooler than me at college? Which, spoilers, he probably will. Like, I'm sorry, but this book ends on like this highly idealized like, oh, I'm a full grown person now that I've graduated high school, which I think is a perfect place for this book to end. But it does kind of leave open ended. Like, is she really going to maintain this moment of serenity and tranquility? You know, when I guess she's like 18 or something like that. Like I'm gonna sound like an old person, but I mean, you're still very young when you're 18. There's still a lot of like life choices and decisions that you're going to have to go through, especially if you're going off to college. And so I think the book ends on a good place, but the fact that her biggest question for her future is like, how does Danny fit into this is not something that the book lays a lot of groundwork for. And it felt a little bit anticlimactic to me. But again, those things that I just brought up are pretty minor. I thought this book was really good overall. I enjoyed it. But if I had to pick things that I didn't think quite worked for me, those would be the things that... Oh, yeah. And also, I know that Rebecca maybe is going to say a little bit more, but like Katie Outwing, I don't know. That's just such a weird... That's a weird character. Like, the way that the book... And I realize in the 1960s, and especially in the 19-whenevers this is supposed to take place, like... People didn't have robust language to describe mental health or cognitive ability or things like that. But she is simply portrayed as being like too frail for this world mentally, and that's like she's broken by like strong emotional things. And that I don't know. I just never got her. I never understood like what was supposed to be going on with her. It seemed like she like had waltzed out of like Jane Eyre or something like that. You know, one of these books in which like. Your mental and physical state are like so closely intertwined and like determined by like the whims of like personal fortune or something like that. I don't know. It felt weird and kind of old fashioned, but maybe I'm just not connecting to it like I should.
I agree. I don't want to take the floor from you, though.
The floor is done.
Okay, I agree with you. I have thought that every single time I've read this book, and that is like the one thing that I'm like, what is going on with this character? And I Googled it to see if anybody else was talking about it, and nobody's talking about it because nobody's talking about Irene Hunt, and nobody's talking about this book.
This mysterious. It's because they can't figure out when she was born.
Everybody's sleeping on this book, and I don't understand. But I have a crazy theory that there's no.
This is good. A good start for our discussion on mental health.
There's no. Sorry, that poor use of words from a mental health professional. I should know better. But
it's all right. You quit your job.
You got me off track. So there's no basis for this in the book. There's no evidence. But I have a theory based on when we think this book is set. I think that she might have had a lobotomy. Oh. I think that there's a chance that she was struggling with something mentally or emotionally, and she had a lobotomy, which would make sense. Because my whole thing in this book is like, how did she and Jonathan end up together? Because he is portrayed as this brilliant man. You know, he's very, I don't know, like everybody loves him. He's very charismatic. He's very easy to talk to. Like, it wouldn't make sense for him to marry this woman that couldn't really have an articulate conversation. And you can see her deteriorating throughout the book. Like, but when she comes, everybody's like, oh, she's a bit deranged. You know, let's be nice to her. Let's be tactful. But
at least they're nice to her, which is more we can say of Aggie. Poor Aggie.
Right, but that's my theory. Because in the late 40s and into the 50s, that's when lobotomies became really, really popular in the United States.
I think that seems like a good theory.
So,
and I would... It seems like the sort of thing that an author would allude to in a children's book, but not want to confront directly because it's a children's book. In the same way that, like, it's kind of sort of implied that, what's her name? Carlotta is raped. Just just like Julie would have been. But again, like, the book doesn't say that directly because, you know, as much as this is, like, definitely geared toward, like, the older spectrum of, like, kids, this is still, like, trying to be a kid's book.
Mm-hmm. So for things that I dislike, there's really, I said that there's nothing. I do want to know more about Katie Eltwing. I keep forgetting how you say their last name.
Eltwing, I think.
That girl, Katie. I'd like to know more about what happens to her, but also I think it makes sense that we don't know because we are reading this from Julie's perspective, and a child wouldn't know what was going on. You know, an adult's not going to sit down and explain that to her at the age she was when that was happening. So I think it makes sense that there's that era of mystery. I agree with you about Julie and Danny, and I was going to say something about that, but I was like, I want them to be together. So I don't really have a reason to complain about it, but I do agree. His character and Chris's character, neither of them are ever fleshed out.
I'm sorry, who's Chris?
Her brother that's with her at the beginning, but then her dad finds out he's worried about Uncle Haskell's influence over him, so he sends him to boarding school.
Oh, you're right. And then we never hear from him again.
He comes back every once in a while, but it's just to hang out with her and Danny.
You're right. He barely plays a role.
Yeah, and so those are the only characters that I think she doesn't deal a lot with. And I don't really care about Chris. I think that we don't need more about him. But yeah, I think it's another, like most of these books, it's convenient for them to end up together, so they do, you know.
Yeah.
That's really...
I will also say, I was noticing as you were talking, I compared this to Anne of Green Gables earlier, and I just all of a sudden remembered that Marilla has a long-lost lover that she has to reconnect with, but it's not in the same way because he's already married and whatever. It's
Gilbert's dad.
Yeah, but it's just like a thing. Like, I don't know, it's very tropey. I mean, like, I think part of it is probably like, well, we have to make sure these women who stay single for so long, we have to have a reason that they stayed single and not that they wanted to be independent or maybe single or
I think it's
not
also,
that they were lesbians.
Okay. Well, that's one theory.
I mean, you got to prove that Marilla's not a lesbian.
I think also they don't, in a time where it was more of a tragedy for a woman to be single and to be, like burdened with all this responsibility. Also, Marilla's living with her brother.
Right, yeah, the same deal.
Didn't think about any of
Her
those
single
things.
brother.
But so you don't want their whole life to be portrayed as this like tragic, oh, nobody wanted them. So you have to give them somebody that wanted them and some reason they couldn't be together. And I think Cordelia and Jonathan, they're going to get together. I don't think
it doesn't. I think it's fine in this book. Like it's not a bad like wrinkle to this book, but it is curious that like it happens in both books.
Yeah.
Although I will say, like someone like Cordelia seems so self-assured that it would make complete sense to me that she never wanted to like settle down with somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Like in my head, it would be like no one could ever meet her standards. Like that would be like the rationale, and if that was all that the book told us, that would make sense to me.
But Mrs. Peters does explain. Do you remember?
I do, and it works. Like I said, it works within the context of the book. It's just like a funny thing that comes up in books like this.
So what happens for those that haven't read it is that Jonathan moves off to either teach or go to school, and Cordelia's mom makes her stay and take care of the farm. So she keeps saying she's going to come see him, but never really has the opportunity, and then he moves on, gets with somebody else.
Right, and it's kind of connected with Haskell, right? Because like as the son, he would like be presumed to take care of the farm, but because he's been basically made incompetent by his parents, either neglect or overdoting, depending on which parent we're talking about, he was not able to make the farm.
I just love this book. It's hard for me to, I don't know. I think, and the more times I read it, the more layers that I think, and I think I read it more closely this time than I would have any of those other times for the podcast, but I'm really glad that I did. And I wish more people were talking about this book.
So you're giving it a thumbs up? I'm hearing two thumbs up. I also am giving this a thumbs up. I really like this book. The negative things I had to say earlier did not sway my affection for it. I will also say, because I know that of the very few listeners that we have on this podcast, my parents are among them. This is directly for my mom. I think my mom, if she has not already read this book, would really like this. I recommended
it to her. She's written my name in the front because she borrowed it.
Oh, okay.
She loved it.
Good. Well, I knew that she would love it. Mm-hmm. So, Mom, I'm glad that I knew your taste so well that I could predict it after the fact.
And so did your daughter-in-law.
Yeah. So anyway, like I said, I also give it thumbs up. That brings us to a close for Up a Road Slowly. Any last words on this before we move on?
Nope.
Okay, well...
It's a great book. Sorry for my coughing. It's from pure excitement over this book.
That and
coronavirus.
And COVID-19. Although, is it still COVID-19 at this point?
Yeah, because that's when the virus originated.
Even though all the mutations, it doesn't get a new number?
I don't know. I have no idea.
Well...
Anyway.
I'm sorry that this podcast is hosted by two people who study humanities instead of the sciences. Anyway, next time on the Newberry Chronicles, we're going to be reading Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry by Mildred Taylor, which is the 1977 Newbery Award winner. We're moving forward decade by decade, and so now we're into the 70s now, since Up a Road Slowly was in the 60s. So we will talk about that next time, I suppose. I've not read it before, have you?
Nope.
Yeah, so it'll be a new experience for us both. So looking forward to that.
Thanks for listening.
Bye.